The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace gardens as Kate stood by the window, watching William pack his belongings into a simple black suitcase. His movements were careful and deliberate, each folded shirt and rolled tie placed with the precision of someone trying to delay an inevitable goodbye. She had seen him pack countless times before, for royal duties, state visits, and charity work, but this time felt different. This time carried the weight of finality that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. William's hands paused over a photograph tucked between his clothes. It was from their early days at St. Andrew's University, both of them laughing at something long forgotten. Their faces bright with the kind of happiness that comes from being young and believing the world holds endless possibilities. Kate caught sight of it from across the room and felt her breath catch in her throat. How had they gone from those carefree students to this moment of quiet desperation? The silence between them had grown over the past few weeks, not the comfortable quiet of a couple who understood each other without words, but the heavy silence of two people afraid to voice what they both knew was coming. Royal obligations had pulled William in one direction, while Kate's own path seemed to lead somewhere entirely different. The pressures of public life, the constant scrutiny, and the weight of centuries of tradition had slowly carved a chasm between them that neither knew how to bridge. Kate moved away from the window and sat on the edge of their bed, her fingers tracing the familiar pattern of the duvet cover. She remembered choosing it together during happier times, laughing over fabric samples and arguing playfully about thread counts. Now it seemed like evidence from another life. When their biggest concern was whether the curtains matched the carpet, William closed the suitcase with a soft click that seemed to echo through the room like a gunshot. He turned to face her, and Kate saw in his eyes the same mixture of love and resignation that she felt in her own heart. They had both tried so hard to make it work, to find a way to honor their love while fulfilling their duties. But sometimes love isn't enough to overcome the barriers that life places in your path. The palace staff continued their daily routines. In the corridors outside, unaware that behind the closed door of the royal bedroom, two hearts were breaking in the most dignified way possible. Kate and William had learned early in their relationship that their private moments existed in stolen fragments between public appearances. But this private moment felt like it might be their last. William sat beside her on the bed, close enough that she could smell his familiar cologne, far enough that they weren't quite touching. The space between them felt like an ocean. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, the words they both needed to say still too difficult to voice. Kate understood. Some truths are so painful that speaking them aloud makes them more real than either heart can bear. Outside, London continued its bustling pace. Tourists gathered at the palace gates hoping for a glimpse of royalty. And the world spun on, oblivious to the quiet tragedy unfolding in a room filled with memories and mito bins. Kate looked at William's profile, memorizing the line of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead, storing these details away like treasures she might need later when the loneliness became too much to bear. The morning light shifted, casting new patterns on the wall, and Kate realized that soon William would walk out that door, carrying his suitcase and a piece of her heart that she would never get back. But for now, in this suspended moment before goodbye, they sat together. In their shared silence, two people who had loved deeply and were about to learn what it meant to let that love go. The decision hadn't come suddenly, though it felt like a lightning strike when it finally crystallized in both their minds. It had been building for months through missed dinners, canceled plans, and conversations that never quite happened because one of them was always rushing off to another obligation. William's royal duties had expanded significantly, pulling him toward a future that seemed increasingly incompatible with the life they had dreamed of building together. Kate remembered the exact moment when she realized they were losing each other. It was during a charity gala 3 months earlier, one of dozens they attended together throughout the year. She had been speaking with a group of donors about children's mental health initiatives, passionate and engaged in a cause close to her heart, when she looked across the room to share a moment with William. But he wasn't looking at her. His attention was completely absorbed by a conversation with palace advisors, his face wearing the serious expression he reserved for matters of state. That night, lying in bed after the event, Kate had tried to tell him about an idea she had for expanding their charitable work. But William's responses were distracted, his mind clearly still processing the evening's political discussions. She realized then that they were becoming strangers who happened to share a bed. Two people moving through life parallel to each other rather than together. William's perspective was equally painful. He loved Kate with every fiber of his being, but he could feel the weight of his birthright pulling him toward a destiny that required sacrifices he wasn't sure he could ask her to make. Every day brought new briefings about international relations, economic policies, and constitutional matters that would shape his reign. The young man who had fallen in love with a girl in a university art class was disappearing beneath layers of protocol and responsibility. He had watched his father navigate similar challenges, had seen how the demands of royal life could strain even the strongest relationships. The difference was that his parents had been born into this world of duty and obligation. Kate had chosen it out of love for him, but William was beginning to understand that love alone might not be enough to sustain them through what lay ahead. The conversations between them became increasingly careful, both of them afraid to voice their growing concerns. They moved around each other like dancers who had forgotten the steps, once fluid and natural, now hesitant and uncertain. Friends noticed the change, the way Kate's smile seemed forced at public events, how William's hand no longer automatically found hers in crowds. Kate's family, always supportive and warm, began asking gentle questions about her happiness. Her mother's knowing looks and her sister's concerned texts created another layer of pressure. How could she explain that loving someone completely didn't always mean you could build a life with them? How could she admit that the fairy tale everyone believed in was slowly unraveling? The breaking point came during a weekend at Balmoral, traditionally a time for the royal family to relax and reconnect away from London's pressures. But even there, William was pulled into constant meetings about succession planning and constitutional reforms. Kate spent long hours walking the Scottish Highlands alone, trying to imagine herself in this role for the next 50 years, and finding that vision increasingly difficult to hold. On their last evening there, they finally had the conversation they had both been avoiding. Sitting by the fireplace in William's childhood retreat, surrounded by family photos and memories of happier times, they acknowledged what they both already knew. Their paths were diverging, and continuing to fight against that reality was only causing them both more pain. The words came slowly, carefully. Each one weighted with love and regret. They talked about their dreams, about the life they had planned, about the impossibility of their current situation. There were tears, gentle touches, and the kind of raw honesty that only comes when two people realize they're about to lose something precious. By the time the fire burned down to embers, they had made the most difficult decision of their lives. They would separate, not out of anger or betrayal, but out of love for each other, and recognition that sometimes loving someone means setting them free to become who they need to be. The palace corridors that had once felt like home now seemed endless and cold as Kate walked through them one final time as William's partner. Every portrait on the walls, every piece of furniture, every familiar scent carried memories that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. She had spent years learning these halls, understanding their history, imagining herself as part of their future. Now she was saying goodbye to that imagined future and to the version of herself she had become within these walls. Staff members who had grown fond of Kate over the years struggled to hide their confusion and sadness. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Nelness Morrison, had been with the royal family for 30 years and had rarely seen her professional composure crack. But when Kate stopped to thank her personally for years of kindness, tears glistened in the older woman's eyes. The palace had always been more than just a workplace for its employees. It was a place where relationships formed and lives intertwined. And Kate's departure left everyone feeling the weight of change. William walked beside her through parts of their farewell tour, both of them maintaining the dignity that their positions required even in private moments. Their hands brushed occasionally as they moved through rooms where they had shared quiet evenings, hosted dinner parties, and dreamed about their future together. Each touch was electric and heartbreaking, a reminder of the physical connection they were about to lose forever, in the private sitting room where they had spent countless evenings reading together. Kate paused beside the window seat where she used to curl up with books about royal history, trying to understand the world. She was joining. William stood in the doorway, watching her, and she could feel his eyes on her, like a physical presence. When she turned to face him, the expression on his face was so full of love and regret that she had to look away to keep from crying. They had agreed that this goodbye needed to be private. Away from the media speculation and public scrutiny that had followed their relationship from the beginning. No press releases, no official statements, just two people who had loved each other deeply, taking the time to honor what they had shared before walking away from it. The world would learn about their separation eventually, but this moment belonged only to them. Kate's personal belongings had been packed carefully by staff who understood the significance of each item. The books they had read together, jewelry he had given her for birthdays and anniversaries, photographs from trips around the world. Each piece represented a fragment of their shared life that was now being divided and distributed. Some things would go with her to whatever life awaited her outside these walls. Others would remain here, becoming ghosts of their relationship, haunting the rooms where their love had flourished. The most difficult part was returning the engagement ring that had once belonged to William's mother. Kate had worn it with such pride, understanding the weight of history and expectation it carried. Now, sliding it off her finger and placing it gently in William's palm felt like returning a piece of her own heart. The ring that had once symbolized their future now became a symbol of paths not taken and dreams that would remain unfulfilled. William closed his fingers around the ring, his own hand shaking slightly. They both understood that this wasn't just about returning a piece of jewelry, it was about releasing each other from promises they could no longer keep. The young couple who had believed love could conquer any obstacle were learning that sometimes love means having the courage to admit when conquest isn't possible. As afternoon faded into evening, they found themselves in the garden where William had proposed years earlier. The spot looked exactly the same bench, the same view. The same roses blooming despite the emotional winter they were experiencing. But they were different people now, shaped by years of trying to fit their love into a framework that had ultimately proven too rigid to accommodate their authentic selves. They sat together on that bench one last time, not talking, just being present with each other and with the enormity of what they were doing. The London skyline stretched out before them, millions of lights beginning to twinkle as the city settled into evening. Somewhere out there was Kate's future, uncertain but her own too shape. Somewhere in the opposite direction lay William's destiny. Clear but increasingly lonely, when they finally stood to go inside, Kate knew that the next time she walked through those palace doors would be as a visitor, not as someone who belonged there. The thought should have terrified her, but instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. A sense of possibility. Fragile but real, growing in the space where her royal identity used to be. The morning of Kate's departure arrived with a gray London sky that seemed to mirror the somber mood within the palace walls. William had been awake since before dawn, standing at his bedroom window, watching the city slowly come to life, knowing that by evening, Kate would be part of that outside world, rather than his inner circle. The normalcy of the view, people walking dogs, early commuters heading to work, life continuing its ordinary rhythm, felt surreal when contrasted with the extraordinary goodbye he was about to face. Kate's final preparations were conducted. With the same grace she had brought to every aspect of their relationship, she had declined offers from staff to help her with last-minute packing, preferring to handle these intimate final tasks herself. Each item she placed in her suitcase was a decision about which pieces of their shared life she would carry forward and which she would leave behind. The process was both practical and deeply symbolic, a way of taking control over a situation that had often felt beyond their influence. The car that would take Kate away was scheduled to arrive at a side entrance to avoid media attention. Word had somehow leaked, and photographers were already gathering at the main gates. William felt a familiar surge of frustration at the impossibility of keeping any aspect of their lives truly private. But Kate seemed oddly calm about the prospect of facing cameras during such a vulnerable moment. Perhaps, he thought, the idea of no longer having to maintain a perfect public facade, felt liberating rather than frightening. Their final breakfast together, served in the small dining room they had always preferred for intimate meals. The staff had prepared Kate's favorite foods, fresh berries, warm croissants, and the particular blend of tea she had grown to love during her years at the palace. But neither of them could manage more than a few bites. The weight of unspoken words filled the space between them more completely than any meal could. William had written her a letter, something he could never say aloud without breaking down completely. He handed it to her as they finished their untouched breakfast, his fingers lingering on hers as she took the envelope. Kate didn't open it immediately. Instead, she tucked it carefully into her handbag, saving it for a moment when she would need his words but wouldn't have his presence. The palace staff had assembled in the main, out a corridor to say their goodbyes, a gesture of respect that moved Kate deeply. These people had become part of her extended family, and their genuine sadness at her departure reminded her of how many lives their relationship had touched beyond just their own. The head chef, who had learned to make Kate's favorite desserts, presented her with a small box of homemade chocolates for her journey. The gardener, who had taught her about the palace roses, had prepared a small cutting from her favorite bush, carefully wrapped so she could plant it in whatever garden awaited her. Each goodbye was brief but meaningful. And Kate found herself memorizing faces and voices, wanting to carry these relationships with her, even as she left the context that had created them. When she reached Mrs. Morrison, the head housekeeper, who had become something of a surrogate mother to her, the older woman's composure finally cracked. They embraced without words, both understanding that some bonds transcend circumstance and employment. William walked with her to the car, their pace deliberately slow, as if they could extend these final moments through sheer force of will. Suitcases had already been loaded, and the driver waited respectfully beside the vehicle, his eyes carefully averted from their private farewell. Palace security had cleared a path, but even they seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, their professional vigilance softened by human sympathy. At the car door, Kate and William faced each other for what they both knew would be the last time as a couple. All the conversations they had shared, all the plans they had made, all the love they had built together seemed to crystallize in this single moment. William reached out to touch her face, his thumb gently tracing the line of her cheek. And Kate closed her eyes, memorizing the sensation. When she opened her eyes again, she saw her own pain reflected in his expression, but also something else. A deep, abiding love that wouldn't end just because their relationship was ending. They had learned that love and compatibility weren't always the same thing, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is recognize when you're holding someone back from their true path. Kate got into the car without looking back. Not because she didn't want to see William one more time, but because she knew that if she did, she might lose the courage to leave. As the car pulled away from the palace, she felt William's presence behind her like a physical force, and she knew he was, standing there watching until she disappeared from view, holding vigil over their love even as it transformed into memory. The cottage in the Cotswolds that Kate had chosen for her new beginning was everything the palace wasn't: small, private, and blessedly ordinary. She had found it through a discreet estate agent who specialized in helping high-profile clients disappear into normal life, and from the moment she first walked through its rose-covered doorway, she knew it was where she needed to heal. The low ceilings, uneven floors, and windows that looked out onto fields instead of formal gardens felt like a gentle embrace. After years of living in spaces designed to impress rather than comfort, William, meanwhile, threw himself into his royal duties with an intensity that worried those closest to him. Without Kate to provide balance and perspective, he seemed determined to prove that he could carry the weight of his future crown without showing any signs of the heartbreak that everyone could see in his eyes. His schedule became impossibly full: charitable engagements, state functions, meetings with government officials, and international trips that kept him moving constantly, as if stopping might allow the pain to catch up with him. Kate's days in the cottage began with simple pleasures that felt revolutionary after years of rigid schedules. She woke when her body felt ready, made her own breakfast without consulting anyone about appropriateness or dietary requirements, and spent hours in the small garden, learning to tend plants with her own hands rather than watching professional gardeners maintain formal landscapes. The physical work of digging, planting, and weeding became a form of meditation. Each interaction with the soil helping to ground her in her new reality. She had deliberately chosen not to have television or internet for the first few weeks, wanting to disconnect completely from news about the royal family and speculation about her departure. Friends and family respected her need for solitude, though her mother called regularly just to hear her voice and confirm that she was taking care of herself. These conversations were careful and gentle, focusing on practical matters like whether she needed anything from town or if the cottage was staying warm enough, avoiding the emotional territory that Kate wasn't ready to explore. William's public appearances during this time became studies in controlled emotion. Palace press secretaries worked overtime to deflect questions about Kate's absence, but William's changed demeanor was impossible to hide completely. Those who knew him well could see the effort it took for him to maintain his composure. The way his smiles came a fraction of a second too late. The slight stiffness in his posture that suggested someone holding himself together through sheer will. At night, alone in rooms that still held traces of Kate's presence, William would find himself reaching for his phone to call her. Then, remembering that their separation meant creating space for both of them to figure out who they were as individuals. The discipline required to respect that boundary was perhaps the most difficult part of his entire royal training. He had been taught to endure public scrutiny, master complex protocols, and represent his country with dignity, but no one had prepared him for the specific agony of loving someone you couldn't be with. Kate discovered that freedom. Royal obligations left her with time to reconnect with parts of herself that had been dormant for years. She began painting again, setting up an easel by the cottage's largest window and working with watercolors to capture the changing light across the fields. The paintings were amateur and imperfect, but they were entirely hers in a way that nothing had been for a very long time. She also started writing in a journal, not about William or their relationship, but about small observations, the way morning frost looked on spiderwebs, sound of sheep in distant pastures, the satisfaction of successfully baking bread. Both of them were learning to sleep alone again, and both found it one of the most challenging adjustments. Kate had grown accustomed to William's steady breathing beside her, the warmth of his presence even when they weren't touching. William discovered that the palace bedrooms felt enormous and cold, without Kate's soft movements and gentle murmurs in her sleep. They were both experiencing the particular loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being alone after years of intimate companionship. Letters arrived for Kate, from well-wishers around the world who had somehow learned of her whereabouts. People expressing support for her decision and sharing their own stories of difficult choices made for the sake of personal authenticity. She was surprised by how many people seemed to understand that leaving something beautiful didn't necessarily mean it had been wrong, just that it had run its natural course. As weeks passed, Kate began to venture into the nearby village initially, nervous about recognition, but gradually discovering that the local residents were more interested in protecting her privacy than exploiting her presence. The postmaster, baker, and shopkeepers treated her with friendly normalcy, as she realized that this was perhaps the first time in years that people were responding to her as an individual rather than as half of a famous couple. William, during this same period, was struggling with a different kind of recognition. Every public appearance generated commentary about his changed demeanor, speculation about Kate's absence, and analysis of what their separation might mean for the monarchy's future. He found himself longing for the anonymity that Kate was discovering, the freedom to process his emotions without constant observation and interpretation. 3 months after their separation, Kate and William met for coffee at a small cafe in Bath, chosen specifically because it was far enough from London to avoid attention, but neutral enough that neither would feel like they were returning to old patterns. They had agreed to this meeting through carefully worded messages passed through mutual friends, both recognizing that they needed to see each other to understand how their decision was affecting them individually and collectively. Kate arrived first, choosing a corner table where they could speak privately. When William walked through the cafe door, her heart performed the same small leap it had done for years whenever she saw him, a physiological response that apparently hadn't gotten the message about their changed circumstances. But when he approached the table, she also noticed something new in his bearing, a kind of centered calmness that hadn't been there during their final weeks together. William saw similar changes in Kate. The tension that had lived in her shoulders for months had eased, and her smile, when she offered it, seemed to come from a deeper, more authentic place than the careful expressions she had worn during their final palace appearances. Her hair was simpler, her clothes more casual. Everything about her suggested someone who was finally comfortable in her own skin. Their conversation began carefully, with updates about daily life that skirted around the deeper questions they both carried. Kate told him about her cottage, her painting, her rediscovery of cooking for pleasure rather than nutrition planned by palace staff. William shared stories about his increased charity work, a new environmental initiative he was developing, and his growing confidence in his role as future king. Neither mentioned the loneliness, though both could see it reflected in the other's eyes. As their coffee grew cold, they began to address more substantial truths. Kate admitted that she had been wondering if they had given up to Isley, if fear had driven their decision more than wisdom. William confessed that he sometimes lay awake imagining alternative scenarios where they had found a way to make their love compatible with his destiny. But even as they spoke these doubts aloud, they both recognized that their time apart had confirmed what they had sensed but been afraid to acknowledge. They were becoming better versions of themselves separately than they had been able to be together. Kate described the relief of making decisions without considering their impact on royal protocol, the joy of pursuing interests without calculating their appropriateness for a future queen. William talked about his growing ability to embrace his responsibilities without resentment, or no longer feeling guilty about the demands his position placed on those he loved. They were discovering that their separation, painful as it had been, was allowing them to develop into individuals who might eventually be capable of healthier relationships. The conversation turned to memories. They found themselves laughing about shared experiences that had seemed stressful at the time, but now felt precious in retrospect. Their first official royal engagement together, when Kate had been so nervous she could barely speak. The time William had attempted to cook dinner for her birthday and nearly set the palace kitchen on fire. Their trip to Scotland, where they had gotten lost hiking and spent an entire afternoon sharing stories and dreams before finding their way back to civilization. These memories weren't painful now. They were treasures they could both carry forward. Without regret, they realized they had learned to love each other in circumstances that were almost impossible to navigate. And the fact that their love hadn't been sustainable didn't diminish its reality or importance. Some relationships, they understood now, are meant to be stepping stones rather than destinations, preparing us for whatever comes next rather than lasting forever. As the afternoon wore on, they both sensed that this meeting was providing the closure they hadn't realized they needed. They weren't reconciling, and they weren't trying to maintain a friendship that might complicate their individual growth. Instead, they were honoring what they had shared and releasing each other with blessing rather than bitterness. When they said goodbye in the cafe parking lot, their embrace was long and genuine, full of gratitude and love that had transformed but not disappeared. Kate got into her car knowing that William truly supported her choice to build a life outside his world. William drove back to London, understanding that Kate's happiness no longer depended on him, which paradoxically felt like the most loving gift she could have given him. That evening, Kate sat in her cottage garden as sunset painted the sky in watercolor washes of pink and gold. For the first time since leaving the palace, she felt completely at peace with her decision. She wasn't the woman who had almost become queen, and she wasn't the girl who had fallen in love with a prince at university. She was someone entirely new, shaped by both experiences, but defined by neither. William, back at the palace, stood at the same window where he had watched Kate leave months earlier. The view was the same, but his relationship to it had changed completely. He no longer felt trapped by his destiny or guilty about the sacrifices it required. For the first time in his life, He was genuinely excited about becoming the king he was meant to be, knowing that his love for Kate had taught him how to love with both passion and wisdom. Their story had ended not with dramatic confrontation or bitter recrimination, but with the quiet recognition that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone go. They had learned that not every love story is meant to end in marriage, that some relationships exist to teach us how to love ourselves and others more fully. In letting each other go, it found something they had been seeking all along, the freedom to become who they were truly meant to be.